Hello everyone. So in our last video we had started with the chapter of The Address, which is written by Marga Minco, and in today's video we are going to continue with the same story. So now, without wasting any more time, let us begin with the video. So I am going to start reading from the third page of the story. My mother seemed to notice that I was not entirely convinced. She looked at me reprovingly, and after that we spoke no more about it. Meanwhile, I had arrived at the station without having paid much attention to the things on the way. Okay, so the narrator, that is Marga Minco, her mother noticed that she was not convinced and looked at her critically. Because in our last video we had read about Mrs. Dorling, who had just appeared before the war, saying that she was a close acquaintance of the narrator's mother and had started taking the cutlery and the precious belongings in the narrator's house along with her, saying that because of the war in Holland, the narrator and her mother might have to leave their house, and in that case, all those precious objects would be lost. And that is why Mrs. Dorling was carrying those with her, and once the war was over, she would return those objects to the narrator's family. But the narrator was not actually happy with the idea of sending their precious belongings with some unknown lady who was nowhere to be known till before the war, and now that the war was going to begin, she had just suddenly appeared and claimed to be her mother's acquaintance, her mother's relative, and she had started taking their things away. The narrator did not like this idea, and that is why she looked at her mother critically. She wasn't convinced, and her mother noticed that. Anyways, the narrator was thinking of all these things of the past, and by that time she reached the station without noticing any details on the way. I was walking in familiar places again for the first time since the war, but I did not want to go further than was necessary. I didn't want to upset myself with the sight of streets and houses full of memories from a precious time. So the narrator, Marga Minco, passed the familiar things after the war for the first time because they once used to stay in that place, but because of the war they had to move to some other place, and now that the war was over, she had come to this place for the first time. Although she was passing through the familiar things, familiar places, she didn't want to upset herself with the familiar sights of the houses and streets because they reminded her of all the precious times of the past and made her nostalgic. In the train back, I saw Mrs. Dorling in front of me, again, as I had the first time I met her. So in the train, Marga Minko started thinking about Mrs. Dorling as well. Back in the time she saw Mrs. Dorling in person, a day after her mother told her about Mrs. Dorling. It was the morning after the day my mother had told me about her. I had got up late and coming downstairs, I saw my mother about to see someone out. A woman with a broad back. "There is my daughter," said my mother. She beckoned to me. The woman nodded and picked up the suitcase under the coat rack. So, when the narrator had got into the train, she had started thinking about those old times, and back in time she saw Mrs. Dorling in person a day after her mother told her about Mrs. Dorling. And she had woke up late that morning, and as she was going downstairs, she saw the lady with a broad back. Her mother was seeing her out. Her mother introduced her to the lady. The lady signaled to her, and the woman responded with a nod, and she picked the suitcase under the coat rack. Now, over here, the person who is referred to as the woman is actually Mrs. Dorling. And one day, when the narrator woke up late and she came downstairs, she saw that her mother was seeing out Mrs. Dorling. Now, Mrs. Dorling had a broad back. The narrator's mother introduced the narrator to Mrs. Dorling, but Mrs. Dorling was actually not that much interested, and she was more interested to take the things away which she was carrying in a huge suitcase. Mrs. Dorling responded with a nod, and then she picked up the suitcase under the coat rack. Now here the narrator gives description of Mrs. Dorling. She wore a brown coat and a shapeless hat. Does she live far away? I asked, seeing the difficulty she had going out of the house with the heavy case. In Marconi Street, said my mother. Number 46. Remember that. That day, Mrs. Dorling was wearing a brown colored coat and a shapeless hat, and she was carrying a very heavy suitcase with her. Seeing that, the narrator asked her mother if Mrs. Dorling lived far away or not, and the narrator's mother told her the address on that day, and she said that Mrs. Dorling lived at Marconi Street, number 46. I had remembered it, but I had waited a long time to go there. So, after the narrator's mother had told her Mrs. Dorling's address, the narrator remembered that address, but she took too long to visit the place. Initially, after the liberation, I was absolutely not interested in all that stored stuff, and naturally, I was also rather afraid of it, afraid of being confronted with things that had belonged to a connection that no longer existed, which were hidden away in cupboards and boxes and waiting in vain until they were put back in their place again, which had endured all those years because they were things. Okay, so after the war had ended and after the freedom, the narrator was not that much interested to go and get all those stuff and objects back, get all those furnitures and belongings back. Rather, she was afraid. Now, why she was afraid? She was afraid of getting confronted with the past memories and connections that no longer existed because all those objects were associated with the people around her. But those people were not in this world anymore. And that is why the narrator was afraid of getting confronted with the past memories and relations that no longer existed. All those things were frozen back in time, and even if she got back those belongings, she could never get back those lives which were lost in the war, and that is why she was not interested in getting the objects back. Connections were hidden in cupboards and boxes. It seemed that those memories were waiting in vain to be put back to their original places as they had suffered all these years because they were only things. But gradually, everything became more normal again. Bread was getting to be a lighter color. There was a bed you could sleep in unthreatened, a room with a view you were more used to glancing at each day. And one day I noticed I was curious about all the possessions that must be still at that address. I wanted to see them, touch, remember. After my first visit in vain to Mrs. Dorling's house, I decided to try a second time. So, after the war was over, things were getting normal. Bread was getting to be a lighter color, and and the narrator had arranged herself a bed on which she could sleep unthreatened, and she had arranged for herself a shelter, a room which had a view which was far better than what she used to get during the war. But one day she got curious about all the things that were still at that address, that is Marconi Street, number 46. The narrator wanted to see them and touch them, and after the first hopeless visit to Mrs. Dorling, she decided to try one more time. She decided to go to Mrs. Dorling's house once more to get the things back. Now, a girl of about 15 opened the door to me. I asked her if her mother was at home. No, she said. My mother's doing an errand. No matter, I said. I'll wait for her. When she reached Mrs. Dorling's home for the second time, a girl of about 15 years opened the door. The narrator asked that girl about her mother, that is, about Mrs. Dorling. The girl told the narrator that Mrs. Dorling was outside doing some errands, and for that, the narrator decided that she would wait for Mrs. Dorling. An old-fashioned iron Hanukkah candle holder hung next to a mirror. We never used it because it was much more cumbersome than a single candlestick. So, as the narrator followed the girl along the passage into the house, there was a Hanukkah candle holder hung next to a mirror, and the narrator remembered that she never used it as it was unmanageable and inconvenient to use. "Won't you sit down?" asked the girl. She held open the door of the living room and I went inside, past her. I stopped, horrified. I was in a room I knew and did not know. I found myself in the midst of things I did want to see again, but which oppressed me in the strange atmosphere. So the girl who had opened the door asked the narrator to sit down as she opened the door to the living room. The narrator stopped in the living room and she was disturbed. She was surprised as well. She was standing in a room which she knew as well as she didn't. Now, the narrator says that she knew the room because the objects that were kept in that room once belonged to them. And that is why the narrator had used those objects and that is why she knew them. But why does the narrator say that she didn't? Because for so many years those objects were not with her. And moreover, the lives whose memories were associated with those objects were also lost. And that is why she didn't know. That is why the narrator says that she thought she was standing in a room which she knew and she didn't. Another reason for which the narrator said that that is she did not know the room because she was standing in the middle of things that she didn't want to see, or because of the tasteless way everything was arranged, because of the ugly furniture or the muggy smell that hung there, I don't know. But I scarcely dared to look around me. Maybe because of the way the things were arranged, or because of the humid smell in the room, or the ugly furniture, the narrator was like scared. She didn't want to look at everything around her. Now, there might be two reasons for this. First one is everybody has their own different taste. What I might feel to be good and attractive might not be the same for somebody else. So, the way the furnitures were arranged, maybe that didn't go well with the narrator's taste. And the second reason for which the narrator did not want to look at the things around her, maybe because the furnitures did not originally belong to Mrs. Darling. Those objects were not actually theirs, and maybe for that reason, Mrs. Darling did not give much value or importance to those furnitures, and that is why the furnitures were kept just like anything. They were not even well maintained, they were kept in a dirty situation in a dirty way. And maybe for that reason as well, the narrator did not want to look at those objects. The girl moved a chair. I sat down and stared at the wooden tablecloth. I rubbed it. My fingers grew warm from rubbing. I followed the lines of the pattern. Somewhere on the edge there should be a burn mark that had never been repaired. Okay, so the narrator sat down on a chair which the girl had pulled out for her. Here, the girl is Mrs. Darling's daughter. Now the narrator looked at the wooden tablecloth. She rubbed it and her fingers felt warm. And as she followed the lines of pattern, she remembered a burn mark that was never repaired. "My mother will be back soon," said the girl. I have already made tea for her. Will you have a cup? I looked up. The girl put cups ready on the tea table. She had a broad back, just like her mother. She poured tea from a white pot. All it had was a good gold border on the lid, I remembered. So the narrator looked up and she saw that the girl had put 2 cups of tea in front of her on the table. Now this girl, that is Mrs. Dorling's daughter, had a broad back just like her mother. She poured tea from the teapot and it had a gold border on the lid. She opened a box and took some spoons out of it. Okay, so that was it for today's video. We are going to continue with this story in our next video. Just one page is left. Complete this story in our next video. Other than that, if you found this video helpful, then please hit the like button. Thank you.